She is 47 years old, and by the first frost of 1908 she owns nothing but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. Her name is Adelaide Coy, and the man who put her out onto the road was her own brother-in-law, Silas Coy, who inherited the family farm the week her husband died and decided, in the cold arithmetic of his heart, that a childless widow was a mouth he no longer owed feeding. She walked 3 days to reach the rail town of Marrow Creek, Nebraska, with those $11. And when she saw the county notice nailed to the depot wall announcing an auction of abandoned railroad property, she did not walk past it the way a sensible woman might have. She stood at the back of a small, indifferent crowd and, when the auctioneer could find no other bidder for a rusted, padlocked storage car shunted onto a weed-choked spur behind the depot, she raised her hand and said the only sum she could spare. $3. The men around her laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh at a fool who has just wasted what little she has on a heap of forgotten iron nobody else wanted even to look at twice. What none of them knew, what Adelaide herself could not have guessed as she signed her name to the bill of sale with a trembling hand, was that sealed inside that car was something that had been waiting patiently, faithfully, for 40 years, for someone honest enough to find it and brave enough to finish what it had begun. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Coy. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Adelaide had not always been a woman who counted pennies into a handkerchief. She had been born in 1861 in a river town in Ohio, the third daughter of a cooper named Thomas Rayburn, a quiet, exacting man who built barrels for the salt trade and taught his daughters, all four of them, that a thing done honestly was worth more than a thing done quickly. Her mother, Constance, kept the household ledgers herself, a rare enough practice for a woman of her station in those years. And young Adelaide used to sit at her mother's elbow watching the neat columns of figures grow down the page, learning without knowing she was learning that numbers, kept faithfully, could tell the truth even when people would not. It was her father who taught her patience with her hands, how to steam a stave of oak until it would bend without breaking, how to read the grain of a piece of wood the way another person might read a face, how to know when something old and neglected still had good use left in it if you were willing to work for it. Nothing honest is ever truly worthless, Addie, he used to say, tapping a barrel that had sat rejected in the yard for want of a single loose hoop. It only wants someone patient enough to see it right. She married young, at 19, a gentle, hard-working man named Thomas Coy who had come west with his brother Silas to try their hand at wheat farming in the Nebraska panhandle. And though the marriage gave her no children, a sorrow she carried quietly. The way women of that era were taught to carry such things, it gave her 26 years of a particular kind of happiness that does not announce itself loudly but simply accumulates, season after season, like good soil. She learned to keep the farm's accounts the way her mother had kept the cooperages, learned to mend what could be mended before ever thinking of throwing a thing away. Learned the discipline of looking twice at anything the world had decided to discard. Her husband used to tease her that she could find silver lining in a dust storm, and perhaps that was true, but it was not blind optimism that shaped her, it was a hard one. Deliberate practice of attention, the same attention her father had given his barrels, turned now toward a life and a marriage and, eventually, toward a rusted iron box that the rest of Marrow Creek had long since stopped seeing at all. In the small Lutheran church the Coys attended, Adelaide taught the younger children their letters on Sunday afternoons. And more than one neighbor would later remember that she had a gift for making a lost or overlooked child feel, for the first time, that someone had actually looked at them closely enough to notice what they were worth. It was a gift, they would say later, that seemed almost prophetic, given what was still to come. The fall, when it arrived, came the way most true disasters do, not as a single blow but as a slow accumulation of smaller cruelties that only revealed their full shape once it was too late to stop them. Thomas Coy died in the spring of 1907, thrown from a wagon during a sudden hailstorm on the road back from the grain elevator. And Adelaide buried him in the little cemetery behind the church with a grief so total that for weeks she could hardly remember to eat. It was in the fog of that grief that Silas Coy, who had always resented that his younger brother's name alone appeared on the farm's deed, produced a set of papers, hastily drawn, conveniently timed, and witnessed by two men who owed him money at the feed store, asserting that the land had, in fact, always been held jointly, and that as the surviving male Coy, the whole of it now passed to him. Adelaide, still raw with mourning and without the money to hire a lawyer to contest a filing already recorded at the county courthouse, watched the only home she had known for 26 years pass out of her hands within the space of a single autumn. Silas did not even have the decency to let her stay through the winter. He informed her, standing in her own kitchen with his hat still on, that his own family would be needing the house, and that she ought to be grateful he was allowing her to take her mother's quilts and her father's old tool chest before she went. Neighbors who might once have helped were themselves stretched thin by 2 bad harvests and a falling wheat price, and those who could have spoken up for her found it easier, as people often do, to look away rather than involve themselves in a family quarrel that was, after all, none of their business. So Adelaide Coy left the only home of her married life with a carpet bag, a small chest of her father's tools that Silas had not thought worth keeping, and $11 that represented the sum total of what she had managed to sell of her own private belongings, a mother-of-pearl comb, a good winter shawl, a wedding ring that had belonged to her own mother, in the 3 days before Silas's patience ran out. She walked, because she could not afford the stagecoach, following the rail line west toward Marrow Creek, where she had heard there was a boarding house that took in seamstress work, and where, she told herself with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has decided grief will not be the end of her story, she would simply have to begin again. She arrived in Marrow Creek on a gray Tuesday in October of 1908, footsore and hollow-eyed. And it was pure chance, or so it seemed to her then, that brought her past the depot on the very afternoon the county was holding its quarterly auction of abandoned and unclaimed railroad property. A small, dreary ritual attended mostly by scrap dealers looking for cheap iron. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Purdy with a voice like a rusted gate, worked quickly through a list of items nobody much wanted: a broken hand pump, 3 crates of spoiled hardware, a caboose stove with a cracked belly. And then, almost as an afterthought, he gestured toward the far end of the yard, where a single boxcar sat alone on a short spur of track so overgrown with sumac and thistle that its wheels were nearly buried, its paint long since weathered to the color of an old bruise, its heavy sliding door secured by a padlock so rusted it looked fused to the hasp itself. Storage car, Purdy called out without much enthusiasm. Abandoned property, no manifest on file, sold as is, buyer responsible for cutting their own lock. Nobody moved. A scrap dealer muttered that the iron in the wheels alone wasn't worth the trouble of hauling it off the spur, and the crowd had already begun drifting toward the exit when Adelaide, standing at the back with her carpet bag still gripped in one hand, felt something she could not entirely explain, not hope exactly, not yet, but a kind of stubborn curiosity. The same instinct her father used to have standing over a rejected barrel in the cooperage yard. She thought of what little she had left in the world, $11, her father's tools, and a lifetime of knowing that neglected things were not the same as worthless things. $3, she said, and her voice surprised her by not shaking. Purdy blinked, glanced around for any other bid, found none, and brought his gavel down with a laugh he didn't bother to hide. Sold to the lady for $3. Lord knows what you'll do with it. She paid him from the handkerchief, feeling the weight of the remaining $8 grow suddenly very small indeed, and stood alone in the weeds beside her new and entirely useless possession, wondering, not for the first time that year, whether desperation had finally curdled into foolishness. It took her the better part of 2 days, working with her father's old chisel and a borrowed hacksaw from a kindly blacksmith named Otto Reiner who took pity on the strange, determined widow and refused to charge her for the loan of his tools, to cut through the ruined padlock and force the heavy door along its corroded track. When it finally gave way with a groan that seemed to shake 40 years of silence loose from the boards, what greeted her was not the empty, mouse-eaten storage space she had braced herself for, but a dim, dry interior, remarkably well sealed against weather and vermin alike, containing a single iron-bound strongbox bolted to the floor. A small writing desk built into the corner as though the car had once served as a traveling office, and, hanging from a nail above the desk, a leather satchel gone stiff with age. Her hands trembled as she worked the satchel's buckle loose, and inside she found a thick, cloth-bound ledger, its pages foxed with damp but the ink still legible. And a single sealed envelope addressed, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, to whoever finds this car, and finds it honest. She sat down on the dusty floorboards right there. 40 years of dust rising around her skirts, and broke the seal. The letter was dated the 14th of June, 1868, and it was signed by a man named Elias Vane, who identified himself as the paymaster of the Marrow Creek spur line during its construction. What Adelaide read in the hour that followed changed, quietly and irreversibly, the shape of the rest of her life. Elias Vane wrote that in the final months of the line's construction, the railroad's regional agent, a man named Josiah Pruitt, had discovered that the company's eastern office was slow to audit its western payrolls, and had begun systematically withholding wages owed to the crews who had laid the track, most of them Irish immigrants, freedmen recently come north, and a contingent of Chinese laborers brought in from the Central Pacific work further west, paying them only a fraction of what the ledgers showed they were due, and pocketing the difference himself under the cover of administrative deductions that existed nowhere but in his own accounting. Vane, who had kept the true payroll ledger himself as was his duty, discovered the fraud in the spring of 1868 and confronted Pruitt directly, only to be told, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that if he pursued the matter through proper channels, Pruitt would simply falsify the ledgers further and see to it that Vane himself was blamed for the missing funds, a poor paymaster with no family influence against a well-connected regional agent. Rather than allow the wages to be stolen outright, Vane wrote, he had quietly withdrawn the outstanding sum in coin from the company's own strongbox before Pruitt could reach it, sealed it inside this very storage car along with the true ledger recording exactly what each man was owed, and arranged to have the car shunted onto the disused spur behind the depot. Intending to return within the month, once he had found a lawyer in Omaha willing to take up the workers' cause, and see every laborer paid what he was rightfully due. He never returned. A brief, aching postscript, added in a different, more hurried hand, Adelaide would later learn it belonged to the Marrow Creek stationmaster of that era. A man named Corwin Ashby, explained that Elias Vane had died of a fever that same summer before he ever reached Omaha, and that Ashby, fearing Pruitt's influence and having no proof beyond Vane's word against the word of a powerful company man, had lacked the courage to open the car himself or to make its existence known, and had instead let it sit, forgotten, praying that someday an honest hand would find it and finish what Vane had started. Adelaide sat in that dim car for a long while after she finished reading, the ledger open across her knees, and felt something she had not expected to feel amid so much loss, a fierce, clarifying sense of purpose. She was not a fool for spending her last $3 after all. She was, whether she had known it or not, the honest hand Elias Vane had been waiting 40 years for. She did not act rashly. She spent the following week quietly cross-referencing the names in Vane's ledger, nearly 60 of them, Irish and Chinese and black laborers alike, along with the exact sums the railroad company had cheated each one of, against the current residents of Marrow Creek and the surrounding county. Working late by lamplight in the small room she rented above the boarding house, using the same patient, exacting method her mother had taught her over the household accounts so many years before, she found that a surprising number of the original laborers, or their widows and grown children, still lived within a day's ride, a Chinese laundryman named Wing Lo, whose father had laid track for 6 months and never seen half his wages, an elderly Irish woman, Bridget Halloran, whose late husband had broken his back on that very line, a black farrier named Reuben Cross, whose father had died before ever collecting a cent of what was owed him. What Adelaide did not anticipate was that the name Pruitt still meant something in Marrow Creek, and not in a way that boded well for her. Josiah Pruitt himself was long dead, but his son, Wendell Pruitt, had grown into the town's most prominent banker, a man who had built his considerable fortune, it now seemed painfully clear. On the very foundation his father had stolen from those laborers' pockets, and who sat, moreover, on the county board that had authorized the property auction in the first place. When word began to circulate, as word inevitably does in a town the size of Marrow Creek, that the widow who'd bought the old storage car had found something inside it, Wendell Pruitt did not wait to learn what. He arrived at Adelaide's boarding house within 2 days, immaculately dressed, unfailingly courteous in the way of men who have never had to raise their voice to get what they want, and informed her that whatever she had found aboard railroad property legally belonged, by the terms of the original bill of sale, to the county, and by extension, given his family's long service to the region's rail interests, to him as executor of unresolved company matters. He offered her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, the sum of $50 for whatever she had found, to save everyone the trouble of a dispute, and made it plain, in the mild, unhurried way powerful men make such things plain, that a woman alone, new to town, with no family and no lawyer, would find Marrow Creek a difficult place to make a living if she chose to be difficult herself. Adelaide did not sleep well that night, turning Vane's ledger over and over in her mind, weighing the $11 that had first brought her here against the $50 Pruitt now dangled before her. Weighing also the plain, uncomfortable fact that she was exhausted, and alone. And that it would have been the easiest thing in the world to take the money and let the past stay buried where it had lain for 40 years. But she thought of her father, standing over his rejected barrels insisting that nothing honest was ever truly worthless, and she thought of Elias Vane, dying of fever in a strange city with his mission unfinished, and she thought, too, of the particular cruelty of Silas Coy standing in her own kitchen with his hat on, taking what was not rightfully his simply because the law and the moment allowed it, and she found, somewhere in the small hours of that sleepless night, that she could not bring herself to become one more link in that same chain of quiet theft. In the morning she went not to Wendell Pruitt's bank but to the county courthouse, where she paid a modest filing fee with nearly the last of her $11 to have Elias Vane's ledger and letter formally entered into the public record as historical evidence pertaining to unpaid wages on the original spur line. A legal maneuver suggested to her, in a stroke of good fortune she would always consider providential, by a young circuit lawyer named Horace Deming who happened to be passing through Marrow Creek that very week and who, upon hearing her story over a cup of coffee at the boarding house, agreed to take her case for a small share of whatever might eventually be recovered, moved as much by the plain justice of the thing as by any hope of a fee. What followed was not swift, and it was not easy. Wendell Pruitt, once he understood that Adelaide would not be quietly bought off, moved to discredit her, suggesting to anyone who would listen that the widow Coy had likely forged the ledger herself, or at the very least misread an old paymaster's private notes as something more sinister than they were. And for a tense fortnight the town of Marrow Creek found itself divided between those who remembered, or whose parents had told them of, the hardship the original rail crews had suffered, and those who owed their livelihoods to Pruitt's bank and were disinclined to make an enemy of him over what seemed, to them, an old and inconvenient story. Adelaide bore the whispers and the cold shoulders with the same steady patience she had once brought to her father's barrels, going door to door herself with Horace Deming's careful help, showing Wing Low and Bridget Halloran and Reuben Cross the entries in the ledger that named their own fathers and husbands, watching their faces change from disbelief to a kind of stunned, grieving recognition as 40-year-old wrongs were finally given names and numbers and a chance at redress. It was Bridget Halloran, in fact, elderly and sharp-tongued and utterly unafraid of Wendell Pruitt's bank, who turned the tide, standing up at a public meeting called to settle the matter and declaring, in a voice that carried clean across the hall, that she remembered the summer her husband came home half-paid and broken-backed, and that she would sooner see every penny of that ledger given to the county poor fund than let another Pruitt walk off with what his father had stolen. The county board, faced with a documented ledger, a formally filed legal claim, and a growing crowd of citizens who had begun to remember, uncomfortably, exactly whose grandfather had built the bank Wendell Pruitt now presided over, could not simply dismiss the matter as Pruitt had hoped. And within the month a county magistrate ruled that the contents of the strongbox, some $1,100 in gold and silver coin, An enormous sum for that place and time, were to be distributed according to the wages recorded in Vane's original ledger, to the laborers themselves where they could be found, and to their direct descendants where they could not. Adelaide could have claimed, quite legitimately, a considerable finder's portion for herself, and Horace Deming gently suggested she was entitled to do so. But she thought again of her father's barrels, of Elias Vane's 40-year vigil, of the plain fact that she had not truly lost anything to Pruitt the way Wing Low and Bridget Halloran and Reuben Cross's father had lost their rightful wages. And she asked instead that her own share be set aside, along with a portion contributed by several grateful families once they received their long-overdue payment, to establish a small public schoolhouse on the very spot where the old storage car had stood, so that the children of Marrow Creek, laborers' children and farmers' children and, in time, even Wendell Pruitt's own grandchildren, sitting side by side in the same plain room, might grow up knowing that an honest ledger, kept faithfully, could still find its way home even after 40 years in the dark. Wendell Pruitt, for his part, faced no dramatic public ruin, no theatrical comeuppance. His punishment was quieter and, in its way, more fitting, the slow, irreversible erosion of the unquestioning trust his family's name had commanded in Marrow Creek for 2 generations, as the town came, gradually, to understand exactly what fortune his bank had been built upon, and to conduct its business with him afterward with a wary, watchful courtesy that never again resembled the easy deference he had once enjoyed. He kept his bank. He did not keep his standing. And in a town as small and as memoried as Marrow Creek, that quiet forfeiture proved punishment enough. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, exactly where it began, with a 47-year-old widow, cast out by her own family, walking into a strange town with $11 and a lifetime of learning to see value where others saw only neglect. Adelaide Coy did not set out that October afternoon to right a 40-year-old wrong or to humble a powerful man. She set out, quite simply, to survive. Guided by nothing grander than her father's old conviction, murmured over a rejected barrel in an Ohio cooperage yard, that nothing honest is ever truly worthless if someone patient enough is willing to look closely and work to see it made right. It was that same patience, applied first to a stranger's ledger and then to a town's long-buried shame, that ultimately restored to Wing Low and Bridget Halloran and Reuben Cross what had been stolen from their families, and gave the children of Marrow Creek a schoolhouse built, in every sense that mattered, on the foundation of a debt finally paid. The $3 she spent on a rusted, padlocked storage car that nobody else in that yard thought worth a second glance turned out to be the wisest investment of her life. Not because it made her wealthy, she remained, by choice, a woman of modest means for the rest of her days, taking in sewing work and eventually teaching alongside the very schoolhouse she had helped to build, but because it gave her the chance to become, for Elias Vane and for every laborer he had died trying to protect, the honest hand he had spent 40 years waiting for. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Adelaide Coy and the long-sealed storage car that waited 40 years for someone patient enough to find it. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs to be reminded that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often carry more worth than the world is willing to admit. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that others had already written off. Until next time, stay close.